in terms of people that could actually translate in their native tongue. Stephanie speaks like 4 languages, so she covers a lot of territory for us. I also wanted to flag that we are planning to go out to the field again. So I would love suggestions as to what to think of in this next round of surveying. All of the data you'll see that I'll present here today are from prior to the development of a safe and effective vaccine for COVID-19. All right, so with that, I'll get started. So obvious, and actually Athene, want to make sure that was such a beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. I want to make sure I'm on time. Should we go to 1? Is that right? Okay, perfect. So the notion that humans have natural inalienable rights to is like the foundation of liberal democracies, going all the way back to law. And political philosophers sometimes call civil liberties sacred values. So these are non-tradable goods, things that have absolutely no price, or you might think of it as an infinite price. And for the purposes of this talk, we'll think about civil liberties as those that have been codified in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, such as the right to privacy, the right to movement, free movement, the right to self-determination, which is also known as procedural fairness. Yet historically, when societies confront major crises, be they wars, natural disasters, or of course pandemics, oftentimes this trade-off between civil liberties and security becomes especially stark. And the policy response to sort of securitizing the situation often involves a rollback on some level of those civil liberties, at least temporarily. So in this paper, we want to try and tackle 3 major questions. The first one is, what are citizens willing to sacrifice, and what are they steadfast in supporting no matter what the circumstance? So this is looking across the different domains, if you will, of civil liberties, privacy, free movement, et cetera. Is there heterogeneity there? And then how does this vary across countries and within countries across different individuals? And in particular, we'll really hone in on what variation in the willingness to sacrifice civil liberties might tell us about underlying social inequality. And so in economic terms, we're interested in how this elasticity between how much you hold on to civil liberties varies with security risk, how that might actually be some function of your social status. And obviously, and some people in this room know this even better than I, this has felt this more than I. This pandemic has been a terrible shock, so much death, so much disruption. But it has been a common shock in the sense that particularly prior to the advent of these safe and effective vaccines, really all countries had the same fairly rudimentary toolkit to try and control the epidemic. And that was a series of restrictions on gatherings, on movement, eventually masking. And so it helps us, these questions that we're going to be asking that we developed, some were taken from the World Values Survey, some were developed for the purposes of our project. You could really ask these sorts of questions at any time, but their relevance and their salience might be very much out of place. But here you have people, from all different walks of life, from all different countries, having to confront this threat. And so that's what we view as researchers as an opportunity. It builds on this larger literature in economics, and I'm sure there's also robust literature outside of economics to try and understand where preferences come from. So there's been some nice work by Paola Giuliano and colleagues looking at the effects of growing up in a recession. It makes you more willing to support welfare programs, safety net programs, the effects of growing up under communist rule, and just what affects your preferences for redistribution more broadly. So when the pandemic started, or when it became, when we became more aware, this was early days of February 2020. There were some discussions of this is actually between law professors at Harvard Law School talking about whether some of the steps that were being taken in other countries that could potentially be taken here, were they unconstitutional? This was sort of a high-level debate that was going on really among legal scholars. But of course, as the pandemic broadened, there was a lot of ink spilled across multiple different democracies, all kind of, again, struggling with this same question. So we have Canada, Australia, France, the largest democracy, India, Spain, Great Britain, and all of these are countries in our sample. So how do we try and answer or make progress on these three questions? Well, we actually conduct representative surveys involving approximately 550,000 responses across 15 countries from March of 2020, around the time that at least the WHO declared a pandemic, until January 2021, which was the month after, a few days after actually the EUA for the Pfizer vaccine was approved. And what we're going to find is significant heterogeneity, just descriptively, across countries, which may be not that surprising, but also across demographic groups in willingness to sacrifice rights for public welfare. In particular, we find that citizens who are disadvantaged by income or education or race are more inelastic or less willing to sacrifice their civil liberties than their more advantaged peers. And we see this practically in every single country that we have data from. And this suggests to us that perhaps civil liberties aren't these non-tradable goods, but they might actually be, quote, luxury goods. Yes?
Might that be related because they have less civil liberties to begin with, at least not less able to enjoy them? They may exist on paper, but their ability to actually enjoy them might be more limited.
Yeah, no, that is a very good point. We puzzled over this finding quite a bit. It's not, I cannot say that we anticipated it. I mean, we wanted to look at these social gradients broadly moving into the project, but I think that's certainly one theory. One thing that we've also dialogued with some colleagues, for example, I've worked a little bit with the former president of the NAACP, Cornell Brooks, and we actually brought these results to him because it's pretty striking also for Black and white Americans. You see this divide. And our thought was that, if you think about like substitute technologies for getting your preferences codified into policy, people that are more advantaged, they have the vote, but they also have, networks and other ways to kind of actualize their preferences in a way that I think for less advantaged individuals in democracies, the vote is the major way to get your preferred policy actualized. So that was also sort of a hypothesis that we had in mind. But I think it's not, we're just going to state that. We're not going to be able to kind of nail that for you today. Yes, Emilio.
I have one question. You call it civil liberties.
Right.
Of course, some of the things that were proposed and were resisted were just the regulation of the pandemic. It was like, the COVID took some sort of political dimension. Things
Yeah.
that government used to do all the time with, with regulating driving or something,
Yeah.
was presented as a violation of civil liberties, and so it became like, so the people who support right-wing
Yeah. So in some sense, maybe what is a civil liberty is endogenous to the regulation. So it's absolutely, and you should have in mind that when we're talking about civil liberties, we're talking about, practically speaking, we're talking about, are you okay with the government taking away a liberty that you might have? For example, the government interfering in the media, which you might want them to do during a pandemic to kind of quell misinformation or something like that. So it's sort of rolling back a right, and the residual claimant on that right would be the government in that sense. Not quite the mapping to sort of the natural rights that Locke had in mind, but to the extent that democracies view those rights and are supposed to guarantee those rights and protect those rights, the government is now kind of clawing them back, I guess, is the way we view it. Other questions? Okay, great. Thank you. So our takeaway estimate here is that a 1 standard deviation increase in health insecurity increases willingness to sacrifice rights by about 3/4 to 90% of the gap between the average US and Chinese citizens. So that's one of the biggest gaps we have in the data in terms of views on willingness to give up rights are between US and China, and we can cover a lot of that gap by, through our methods, either experimental or using natural variation, to kind of increase the salience or the security threat that people feel. And so that's another kind of unique feature of this paper, is that we do leverage both sources of variation. So we have an experimental information experiment, and then we have the natural variation in death rates that we're also leveraging. Okay, so now I'll tell you a little bit about the surveys that we used and some of the measures. So we had 2 large-scale online surveys. So this longitudinal survey was slightly over 535,000 responses from about 300,000 unique respondents. And we had 13 countries represented. So we had Australia, Canada, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Singapore, Spain, Sweden, the UK, and the US. And we received approximately 1,000 responses per country per week. And that's again from March 2020 to January 2021. And we included what we call our core civil liberties trade-off module in that survey. In addition to that, we had an in-depth survey with about 13,000 respondents, and this was a partially overlapping subset of the countries above. So we included China, France, Germany, Italy, South Korea, the UK, and the US. And so we wanted to include both China and South Korea. China is an example of a communist state, and South Korea is an example of a democracy, but in East Asia. So we had sort of a strong sense of communitarianism possibly in the Asian countries, and also a diversity in terms of how they organize their government. But this survey, this in-depth survey, was really concentrated in the spring of 2020, so late March to mid-April. And in addition to the core civil liberties trade-off module, we also added these questions, sort of the canonical philosophical question about how many lives would needed to be saved for you to support a policy. And we had this experiment embedded, an information experiment embedded in this in-depth survey, which I'll talk about in a few slides, but basically raising the salience of the COVID threat versus not, as a first stage towards increasing people's concerns about their health security. Yeah? So this would have been extremely expensive for us to run, and is prima facie evidence of the importance of relationship building. So, as students, this is important to note as well. So this is from a large survey company where we ran the in-depth survey, and then we said we'd really love to add our module on your regular survey this is a survey firm that you're running in all these countries anyway. So they are always, they have their own panels and they're doing representative surveys in the background all the time, and they're selling those data. And so we actually ran this for free, but we couldn't add everything. That's why it's a very targeted subset of questions. Yes, but we did a little bit for them. I gave some statements about how they were good partners, and they were. So yes.
Yeah, I wonder, maybe you get to this, but how comparable are the people who answered in these different countries in terms of education income?
Yes.
You say they representative surveys, but I always wonder about online surveys, whether you're really missing a certain segment of the population,
Yes.
particularly in places like India.
Yes, I would.
Say something about that.
Yes, absolutely. So we have in the back of this paper tables that show they look fairly representative compared to sort of census counts. Where I think all online surveys miss the mark is on the education profile. So we do some things to re-weight. We construct our own survey weights to make them look more like the census, and we have weighted and unweighted versions. But, that's assuming that you can really blow up the less educated person that happens to, and I think that is, so, but in terms of how that would affect our results, and of course by results I'm talking about the descriptive findings, which I actually find, pretty fascinating. I think they're probably understating the degree of divergence, if you will. But it's a great question, and I think it's not. It's something that courses through all of the work that we're doing with COVID and online work. Okay. So then we did a smaller validation survey. So this was a very small scale survey, and the purpose of this was we contracted with the same company in April of 2021. So this was after our major data collection efforts were completed. And the purpose of this was the way we wanted to show that our questions were robust to the way we frame them, and that the questions were actually also indicative of actual behavior. So we have an objective outcome, if you will. Economists revealed preferences. It's not what you say, it's what you do. So we have one sort of objective measure, downloading an app that tracks you in our in-depth survey already. But we wanted to expand that. And the in vogue thing in information experiments is to really show that you are not just saying that you support something, but you actually support something. How about, would you sign a petition against vaccine mandates? Or would you, if the researchers had money that they could donate, would you want them to donate to a nonprofit that protects privacy, et cetera? So these are some of the more, what we call incentive compatible measures of preferences. And we find that our questions are highly correlated with these actual incentive compatible, more objective measures. Okay, so what did the core civil liberties trade-off module look like? And this is kind of getting back to Emilio's question about what, this is really, in our conceptualization, the government taking away rights. So I am willing to sacrifice, the most generic version is my own rights and freedom during a crisis like the current one for the health and well-being of society. It's kind of making that trade-off as salient. And then in addition to general rights and freedoms, we asked about 5 other domains. So we asked about, would you be willing to sacrifice privacy, democratic procedures, free movement, and free press? They have that same structure. In the minimum lives saved module, we said out of every 100 people who would have otherwise died in your country because of the COVID-19 pandemic, some will be saved if one of the following policies is implemented. What's the minimum number of lives that each of the following policies would need to save in order for you to support it? So this, we had a total of 11 questions, including privacy and free movement. Here we also had more of the sort of regulatory business components as well. We actually don't see a lot of movement on that. So it's, I believe, in the appendix slide. And we had both sort of a less strict and a more stringent version of these. Let me see if the example. Okay, so these actually, in terms of survey design, I know a lot of people in this room think a lot about this too. These are hard questions, I think, for people to answer. That's why we did a validation survey, because this is a scale that's already restricted. We had like an unrestricted scale in the validation. So one thing we did was first we practiced with them. So we said, you know, if you supported this policy, should you have a higher or lower number of lives saved? And then, so they could only continue if they were able to answer that question correctly. And then when they moved the slider, this sentence down here would actually populate, so they could see kind of what they were agreeing to. So that was just a little bit of JavaScript to the Qualtrics. And then this is an example of sort of the 2 tiers of stringency, another way to kind of check the sensibility of our results. So can the government track the smartphone locations and social contact data of the citizens who test positive for COVID-19? Or can they just track everyone, period? Like that would be the more extreme version, if you will. And presumably the minimum lives saved should be higher for the more extreme version. Okay, so we also had a contact tracing app that they could download as well. So that's one of and this was something that could work in every context. And then as I mentioned before, as part of our validation for this, we had these questions about, you know, would you want to donate for Privacy International? Do you want to sign a petition so that, you know, these petitions that were circulating, this was done in the United States on change.org. Would you like to sign a petition to basically say the government would not force people to get vaccinated, things of that nature. And as I said before, there's a pretty high correlation between what people answer on our survey questions and these more observable actions. Okay, so now is the descriptive component of the paper. So here we have, we have a lineup of countries. So Sweden joined a little bit later, so we have the star by Sweden. And this, in order to include China and Korea, we're restricting it to the spring of 2020. So these responses, you should think of them as a cross-section in the spring of 2020. I'll show you the dynamics in just a moment. So this is the fraction unwilling to sacrifice own rights. This is the most generic version of the question. And this vertical line here represents the United States. And so we can see that the United States is sort of on the leading edge of this frontier, with with a chunk of the population being unwilling, almost 40% unwilling to sacrifice own rights. Japan and Sweden are actually go beyond the United States. And we can see that that's fairly consistent when we look at relaxing privacy protections, though you'll notice that there's actually, talking about cross-domain, there's a higher fraction unwilling to sort of have privacy protections removed than just the generic version own rights. And it's kind of interesting from a policy perspective. Certainly, some of the countries in Europe have stronger privacy protections, particularly when you're trying to do research. You have to do GDPR restrictions and things like that. But they are actually, in terms of the government accessing data during a crisis, they seem more willing than citizens of the United States. This is also one that's maybe perhaps interesting. Again, we see Japan, Sweden, the US out in front. This is suspending democratic procedures. So for example, putting delays on elections, letting people serve extra terms. And then this is sacrifice-free press. So we didn't ask in China about suspending democratic procedures. That wasn't a relevant question. But in general, you see that China is kind of at the bottom. And one of the biggest gaps, as I mentioned, was US and between US and China. Yes, Amelia.
But so the access is the fraction proportion, so it's still less than half. Overall, is it fair to say that the majority is okay relaxing?
Yeah, I mean, we'll look at the dynamics in a minute, but this is in the very beginning of the pandemic. And what we do see over time, I'm going to have to draw it because I don't actually have it in the slides, but we do see that your willingness, if you think about like your willingness to sacrifice over time, and if you think about health insecurity, like the threat, they kind of both go down over time in raw form, in the raw data. So if this is spring, they reach a nadir, I would say, in the summer. They start coming back up, and then they kind of plateau, and this looks very similar. These two things kind of move very similarly in the raw data. I have to draw this because actually what I'll show you in just a few slides is that even though this is true in the raw data, it's still the case that people who feel more health insecure, who are in the top, percentiles of the health insecurity risk, are more willing to sacrifice, even if the level has shifted. The elasticity is still the same. But this is definitely, so this level will change over time, for sure. Yes?
On the one hand, I guess some of the countries, the gap is fairly small, whereas the actual, what the actual policies are much more restricted varies tremendously. So, if I go down to say about France or so, there's a little bit of a variation in the fraction unwilling, but it is more of a thing. But if I, recall what the various countries done, there was tremendous variation in what they've actually done.
Japan is very interesting to me. I didn't realize this. I poked around. I found one paper that talked about the history of, the pre-World War II history of Japan and the amount of repression that seems, but if people are scholars in this area, Sweden, based on the policies that they were putting in place, basically, live and let live, this was not as surprising to me. But I don't have a great explanation. Yes?
Yeah, you might notice had a huge anti-vaccine.
Oh, is that right?
There's a lot of resistance to the vaccine. So it's changed because of kind of international pressure.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, certainly very, very different from China, where you think collectivism is possibly very high. I mean, Korea is kind of also, South Korea, this is more out there than maybe one would have thought. Yeah.
Have you taken into account at all what
Yeah.
I have the ideal government that I know is going to only use this data in a specific way for health reasons, then I might be willing to do more, or to sacrifice more. But given
Yeah.
the government that I live under right now, possibly I don't trust them enough to do that. And how much of that you can attribute to the result?
Yeah, so three answers. I think that's a great question. I think it relates to Emilio's question about, is this civil liberty? Because we're talking about forfeiting rights to the government. So obviously, how much you think they're an honest broker of that they'll give things back, that they will use your information, with and not abuse it. They'll use it for public welfare, et cetera. That is certainly playing a role. This is all unconditional. We'll control for your belief in sort of government effectiveness a little bit later. And then I'll show you how, again, descriptively, how these results change with sort of political affiliations, which I think is kind of interesting and might speak to that as well. Now, as a benchmark, we also asked how willing you were to endure economic losses. And what's interesting about this pattern is it's really not very similar to the other patterns. So we still have United States kind of marked here with the vertical line, but you can see there are several countries now that are sort of beyond the United States in terms of their unwillingness to sacrifice, for financial security. And even China, which is generally pretty low on all of these scales, is much, much higher in terms of their unwillingness. So at least it seems like there we're getting a very different domain. Here's where we do some starting to get a little bit more at patterns within countries. So we condition on country fixed effects, and we look at, for example, having a medical condition. So having a medical condition makes you about 3 percentage points more likely to be willing to sacrifice civil liberties, which is kind of sensible because those people were plausibly more at risk. What's interesting, and then this is your rank relative to those others in your country, we have this non-parametrically put in, but it almost looks linear, that those who are lower income are less willing to sacrifice their civil liberties relative to the top 25th percentile. In the United States, we see that, and that's about 10 to 12 percentage points. In the United States, again, we see black versus white, less willing, about 9 percentage points, and then those who don't have a college diploma versus those that do, also less willing. That's across all countries. Going to the comment in the back about political identity. So this does your affiliation align with whoever is the prime minister or the president of that country? And here we see, interestingly, that people are more willing to sacrifice to the government if it's their guy in charge. So it doesn't really matter left or right. I mean, in the US, it was right at the time, but then, this is just a very interesting phenomena. Mistrust the media, you're less willing to sacrifice rights. We also looked at this question of exposure. So obviously China versus the West. In China, people are more willing to sacrifice civil liberties. But that's contemporaneous exposure to communism. What about historical exposure to communism? So in our South Korea survey, we had a question about how connected are you, your family members, or yourself to North Korea. We find people are less willing to sacrifice rights. In Germany, it's very noisy, and if anything, shifted right. But remember, these results I'm showing you are from the spring. This is still pretty noisy, but if you go out in time, you now see that residing in a state that belonged to the former GDR actually has, on average, lower willingness, and it just emerges over time. Okay, so now let's look at, yes?
So you asked if their party was in power, but did you just look at left versus right?
Yes, we did that as well. And the pattern that we saw was sort of mixed. And when we actually aligned it with the party in power is where we got something. We just got noise before. And we had an assortment of, there was left and right in power across all these different countries, all these democracies. And when we did it this way, it sort of lit up for us. Yeah. So now, I don't know if anyone has done this study, but I wonder about like vaccine, how people's views of the vaccine when Trump was president versus when Biden was president, if that changed over time in the U.S. I don't have data. I don't have data to know if that's the case. Okay, so here we're looking at individuals, respondents who are below the median income in the United States versus above the median income. And here we have every single month of our data plotted. And you can see that at each point in time, those who are below the median income are less willing to sacrifice rights than those who are above the median income. But what's interesting is that we just see this replicated over and over again, with the exception of Spain. So I don't have a very good explanation for that. But it's a fairly robust observation. Okay, so the last component is trying to actually establish a causal relationship between health insecurity and sacrificing rights. So health insecurity is defined as worrying about your own health or worrying about the public health system being overwhelmed, since both kind of featured prominently into the discussion. And so we do find that this question about, this is an index of health insecurity that we created, which is own health or the healthcare system. We find that it is positively correlated with things that you would hope, like washing hands. So people who are more, say they're more worried about their health are also washing their hands more, staying in home more, working from home, having food delivered, things of that nature. And it is positively associated with willingness to sacrifice own rights. So people, these are in standard deviation units. So if you're more health insecure, you're about 0.05 standard deviation units more willing to sacrifice your own rights. Financial insecurity kind of goes the other direction. For many of these things, though, financial insecurity doesn't have really a robust correlation with your willingness to sacrifice democratic procedures or privacy or free press. So it's kind of a mixed bag, whereas for health insecurity, you see this clear relationship between how health insecure you feel and your willingness to sacrifice rights. Now, maybe this is because people have mixed views on whether the government, whether taking away these rights would actually ensure or erode their financial livelihood. But certainly the directionality descriptively is not similar. Okay. So this last point is that the elasticity between health insecurity and willingness to give up civil liberties is positive and it's stable over time. So as I mentioned to Emilio, even as those levels shift around with pandemic severity, those who are relatively more at risk are still more willing to give up rights. So here we see, again, looking across all these countries, this is the relationship between health insecurity and willingness to give up rights. At every single point in time, it's positive and statistically significant. Blue is financial insecurity and willingness to give up rights. And it's hugging pretty close to the zero line throughout. Okay. So we have two empirical approaches, as I mentioned, a natural experiment and actual information experiment. So the first approach is to use instrumental variables, an instrument for health insecurity, using short-term fluctuations in local COVID-19 mortality. So here we're going to use that longitudinal data that we had access to through our partner. We're going to condition on the cumulative mortality that that area has experienced up to that point. We're going to condition on policies that have been put in place, restrictions on movement or other activities. And we're going to condition on subjective financial insecurity and their views of government effectiveness. So our thought was, so we're trying to really isolate the shock of the mortality that's occurring in your location. And these are admin level 1 is the sort of most granular version of data we could get for all of these different 15 countries. How is that affecting your health insecurity? Conditional on financial insecurity, because of course that would be another natural channel. And conditional on your views of the government, because if the mortality is high, you might think that the government is feckless. And so, obviously we have an exclusion restriction. We think that we've kind of handled some of the more likely alternative pathways. We would note that these alternative pathways probably would lead to people being less willing to give up their civil liberties, in the sense of leading us to be downward biased in our estimates. Because if you play out that argument, my health insecurity, but the COVID shock in my area makes my financial insecurity go up. So I'm less I need to disobey the government and go out despite the fact that the shops are closed to earn my living. Or there's a local COVID shock and I think the government is feckless. Why would I then give up my rights to the government? So we think to the extent that there are these alternative pathways that we've imperfectly conditioned for, they're probably going the other way. We also can include individual fixed effects. We can shuffle around the mortality and do that permutation test, and we don't get the reduced form is gone. And then, of course, the nice thing about the natural variation is you can say something about external validity. The experiment hopefully helps us on the internal validity side. So these are the regressions we're running: COVID incidence on health insecurity and then health insecurity on willingness to sacrifice rights. So here's our OLS, our reduced form, and our two-stage least squares estimates. So I should just note that we were able to ask this question, sacrifice own rights, for each respondent every week. And then we had to choose, the survey chose a random one of these questions. So we actually have less data. I should have the ops count. But we have less data for these outcomes, so they're a bit noisier. We can see that the OLS and the IV are pretty close for sacrifice own rights. So you're about 10 percentage points more likely to want to sacrifice own rights. And that's true in the OLS and the IV. Sacrifice free press, relaxed privacy protection. So remember, this one was the thing that people were most unwilling to do. What actually lights up a bit more here is suspend democratic procedures. So once we feel like we're better identified, we actually see that people are a lot more willing to sacrifice, to suspend voting and whatnot, which is a little bit concerning. And then again, as a benchmark, we can include their willingness to endure economic losses, which tends to be sort of in the middle of the road. So obviously, this is not just a health crisis, but also an economic crisis. This experimental component helps us isolate that health component. So humans have this natural tendency to not understand exponential growth. I think that's fair. So this has been well documented in sort of the financial literature where we don't fully understand how savings, you really should start your savings account earlier. Anyway, to help better understand the exponential nature of disease transmission, we basically did some little mock-ups that I'll show you in a moment and try and make this very, very clear for people. So we basically showed these, these animated, and these were all translated into the native language. But we showed these nodes lighting up, and then we showed these different breaks in the transmission that could potentially occur from the policies. We showed the flatten the curve, so that's why our health insecurity measure also includes sort of a public health component, because we talked about hospital capacity being overwhelmed. And lastly, we took these shots from an overcrowded hospital system where people were waiting on the floor. We mentioned that at least at this time, there were policies in place so you couldn't visit. So if someone died, they would generally die alone. So we included all of that in our experimental condition. And here we see the effects. This is, again, so this table is oriented a little bit different. This is from our in-depth survey. So here we have fewer countries, but more outcomes. So the outcomes are actually listed here. So this is transposed. And the Z-score is sort of the summary. So this is panel A. This is generic rights and freedoms. And the Z-score is sort of a summary index of this panel. Similarly here for protection of privacy, and so on and so forth. And so here we have our OLS. And here we have our two-stage least squares estimate. So this is instrumenting for your health insecurity with your assignment to treatment versus a control condition where you got nothing. And then this is the mean of the outcomes. So you can compare the treatment effect to the mean. And then this is the gap between China and the US. So you can also compare the estimates to that gap. Yes?
Did you run the experiment after first doing the survey?
So the survey flow was we asked the experiment was embedded in the survey. So we asked some basic demographic questions, health questions, and then put the experiment component in. And then all of our outcomes were after that. But this was done in spring of 2020, just to remind you of the sort of thought processes. So we were, we were here we know that from our data. Okay, so we can see that in general, people who receive this treatment are much more willing to sacrifice rights. And that's both individual rights. This is noisier, but also the rights of others. These point estimates are not statistically distinguishable. And then in terms of combining those two things in a Z-score, we see that it's about 37 percentage points. When we look at privacy protections, again, this is you're unwilling to accept tracking sick people. So as I mentioned before, the minimums should be somewhat lower if the outcome is less extreme. So what we find here is that, again, we're seeing that the people who receive the treatment of the health information, they have a lower minimum to, in fact, they need to save fewer lives, in other words, in order for them to support the policy. And we see that the directionality is such that they actually, compared to the control, they actually are the gap is bigger when it comes to tracking everyone. And the control is 54 lives. And so the last one is the contact tracing app. So here, about 47% of people wanted to download that app. So that's a massive 24 percentage points. So that's over half. About half, 50%, you can move to download that app by showing them a bit about the disease. And so our treatment effect is about the same size as the average distance between China and the US. So we can also look at things like prefer strong leader, prefer delegating to experts, willingness to sacrifice free press, and then the Z-score overall for willingness to sacrifice democracy. Again, here we don't have the benchmark for China because we didn't include those questions. Yes, Amelia.
Is there a role for age in this story? This is net of age, or did you know, in this basic description, did you
Yes.
say, given that COVID affected age groups so differently?
Yes. You know, as I remember, it was somewhat nonlinear in the natural variation. So in fact, the health and security, if I just change this to age, looked like this. Slightly nonlinear, and I think the reason why we weren't able to get a strong first stage with in the highest group is because they were actually staying home. So there was almost no, like when you're looking at 70, 80, whatever. Yes?
Did the treatment have any effect on the gap across on the variation by income or education?
No, no. You would have thought maybe it would have closed those gaps. But I don't know if it's because we were at this very sort of where everyone was so concerned because we were running this in spring. Overall, when we use our natural variation, which is, you know, arguably less well identified, but we can see some closure of gaps among many groups. So if, let's say you're in a very high region of COVID incidence in that week, we can sort of bridge some of the education, low versus high, or no college degree versus college degree, by sort of quartiles of health and security risk. One gap that was not able to be bridged for in our data anyway was the black-white gap, which we found very interesting. So even though Black Americans were at felt and were objectively at higher risk of COVID-19, they are still, it didn't matter the level of the risk. It was not able to close the divide. In other words, there was no level of health risk that would close the gap in terms of their unwillingness to sacrifice civil liberties with white Americans. Okay, so good question. So to conclude, in this data, we found that individuals are often willing to trade off civil liberties to alleviate health security, especially among those who are socioeconomically advantaged. And therefore, we view civil liberties more as luxury goods than sacred values, with the caveat, as mentioned before, that we're conceptualizing civil liberty as forfeiting rights to the government in this. So a 1 standard deviation increase in health and security raises willingness to sacrifice rights and freedoms by 9.4 percentage points in our panel, 10.7 percentage points in our repeated cross-section, or 17 percentage points in our information treatment. So fairly consistent across our different ways to measure. Now, how do we interpret these results? It could be that people actually alter their indifference curves. So their preferences literally change due to the effect of this shock. That would not be out of step with some of the recent literature or the major other shocks that the world has experienced. Or it could be just the price of security has changed. It's increased as you enter a pandemic. So you're moving along your indifference curve as opposed to changing the shape of it. But we would argue, at least, using sort of some of the data that we have here, is that even transient moves along the indifference curve could result in long-term individual and societal consequences. Our example of this is downloading a contact tracing app. You might download it in that moment. You might not, delete it right away, and now your data is being made available. Or you might skip an election, and now you have sort of a dictator-in-chief. So that's where we're at. Thank you so much for the time. Yes, Steve.
I was curious how you're extending this, or if you're going back to the field.
Yeah, so we would love suggestions. I think the biggest thing that has changed is the technology. And sort of here we're talking about health and security as if it were totally exogenous. Like, it's the level of, and of course that's a first order approximation because, people could have tell us there was different risks or whatnot. And then we could sort of experimentally vary risk by making things more salient. But now it's sort of a choice in some sense. There's vaccines and boosters and things like that, and that might vary from place to place. So it's kind of an interesting sort of intersection of technology and civil liberties that I think is also an angle we'd like to explore. We're also very interested in schooling, and I think that that I don't believe was very foreseen, that the thing that would really kind of move the marginal, possibly the voter, the pivotal voter, might actually be the restrictions on the schools.
I was curious if, with the first thing, the vaccines, if you could even flip it, if you have some vaccine hesitant folks in your survey, and you say, like, this could happen to your civil liberties, and, like, assess what might happen to their willingness to take up the vaccine.
That would be, yeah.
But, I mean, it's a lot to do. It's like such
Yes.
a cool setup.
Thank you. Yep. Yes, please.
The flattening curve piece would be very salient now because it's clearly not very, have you thought about what you might want to present as information in terms to people that was a flattening curve?
No, you're right. No, that's totally, we've blown through all that. So I think it's kind of open for debate. I mean, one thing that is motivating us to do this is this idea that possibly people have changed where they are on the political spectrum as a result of this shock. So descriptively, I think it's interesting to kind of understand, maybe you could prime people experimentally with policies, and you could look at differences between people that have children or people that don't have children and things like that, to see if they've moved, their views of the current government and things of that nature. That would be one idea. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So quaint, right? Yes, Amelia.
Final comment.
Yes.
I think this is fascinating. I can see how this has broad implications for other areas about, like environmental regulations and all. This is a great exercise. So you're saying about what to think about. I was thinking like, what would they say if the restriction comes from a global entity?
Yeah.
Or if this is not to protect my nationals, but protecting, there were discussions, should we waive the patent rights, to help developing
Right.
countries?
Right.
Maybe things to include about that when
what's the level of
protection
authority
is not,
you're
it's not
ceding
the
to?
national,
Yes.
When it's not just about you and the national, when if it's even about some foreign country.
Right.
Would they do it?
Great.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you
Yes.
go to the World Health Organization, I mean, we did have
Yeah.
a discussion.
Yeah.
With Trump going after the World Health Organization.
Right.
They're very real. Anyway, this was fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much.